Good morning, good afternoon, and very much welcome to today's session that we call the Board of Directors' Role in Compliance and ESG. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by some incredible women, incredible professionals who have many years of experience on this topic and will dig deep into one of the major trends in this space. And before I introduce them individually, there is a global trend, of course, that the focus on corporate governance has really reached the highest level of social awareness, political awareness. And as we move towards recovery from the pandemic, both policymakers and businesses are rethinking the foundations of their activities and their social purpose. This was an expressed topic that we discussed at Refinitiv when we were together with the B20. And also some of the express recommendations to the G20. There's been major legislative motions and requirements that are coming up all across the world, including the EU, who are really looking at putting the corporate responsibility as a key focus and priority for 2021. So there is a convergence here between compliance, sustainability, and social responsibility. There's also, of course, a compliance or convergence between environmental factors, social factors, human and the economic impact of business decisions, and then really a drive to focus on long-term sustainable value creation rather than short-term financial value. And we've seen from our data at Refinitiv that ESG, of course, has received incredible amount of focus. And that if you look at the types of scores that are being tracked by companies and institutional investors, that those governance scores rose in the Americas 9.4%, and in Europe it rose by 17%. So these are the issues that we'd like to discuss, and would very much welcome our incredible panelists. First, we have Susan Divers, who is a senior advisor at LRN. Over 30 years of experience in the ethics and compliance field, and she has built state-of-the-art compliance programs in the private sector and the public sector. And she's also been an official at the Department of State and a member of the U.S. delegation to the UN, working on anti-corruption initiatives. We're also joined by Karen Pudniachik, Director of Columbia's University Global Center and member of a number of corporate boards, including JetSmart Airlines, Chile ISA, and the Chilean American Chamber of Commerce. She also used to serve as the Minister of Energy in Chile. Finally, we also welcome Ana Paula Candeloro, Compliance Director and Board Member of RB Capital. She also serves as a strategic advisor to organizations on ESG, impact investing, and ethics and compliance. She's also a co-author of a number of books and have been recognized as the 20 most admired compliance professionals in Brazil. So it is an incredibly distinguished panelist, and we're delighted for them to join us. So what I'd like to do is invite them each to give opening remarks for about 5 minutes. Following from the opening remarks, we'll then move into Q&A, and very much look forward to the audience's participation and your questions. But without further ado, Susan, if I can invite you to give your opening remarks first. So very much welcome.
Thank you, Shay. And I'm just delighted to participate in the panel. And I've had the privilege of speaking over the years at compliance conferences and ethics events in Latin America, and it's always been an inspiring occasion to do that. I hope that we get the chance to do that live at some point again. So just a quick background about LRN. LRN is 25 years old, and it's probably best described as a hybrid between a business and a think tank. We look carefully and thoughtfully at the compliance area globally. And we try to really help companies and organizations and individuals understand what really works when it comes to compliance. One of the things we've all seen in the last 10 years is that checklist compliance doesn't work. You can have a code of conduct, you can have training, you can have a hotline, but you can still be Wells Fargo or Boeing or Valley Dam. So there's a renewed interest and emphasis on really determining what is effective in terms of leadership in this area and in trying to ensure that misconduct doesn't occur. So with that, let me put up some stats from one of our recent reports. If you go to LRN's website, you'll see that we do publish quite a lot in this area. And these are stats from our Moral Authority report, which came out last year. And as you can see, there really have been some changes in the way people think about ethics and compliance, not just internally, but more importantly, as Karen and Anya will talk about, externally. And there's been a bit of a gap, really, if you look at these stats, between the way people outside corporations think about compliance and company purpose and priority, and the way people inside think about it. Essentially, there's an opportunity for companies to become much more mission-driven because the public perceptions have changed, and that's now the expectation. But if we can go back to slide 5, Augustina, that would be great. But as you can see, only 41% of Fortune 500 CEOs believe solving social problems should be part of their business strategy. But 64% of people generally believe companies' primary purpose should be making the world better. So that's going to change, obviously, and we'll talk about some of the many ways in which it's changing. Most recently, the NASDAQ exchange in the States has proposed rules on board diversity, which would really drive change in that area, for example. So let's go on to the next slide. Another aspect of what's changing for boards and why it's changing is that regulators have caught up. Shay mentioned that in his opening remarks. And this is a bit US-centric, but US regulatory guidance tends to have a broad impact because many companies are listed on US exchanges, and financial institutions are bound by a lot of the sanctions that are put in place. So regulators have gotten much more proactive in the last 2 years in the States in particular. And we spent a lot of time reading and analyzing, and the key principles really that are under emphasis now are, as I mentioned, go beyond check the box. Regulators don't really care if you update your code every 2 years, but they do care whether your program actually works in terms of influencing employee behavior. And there's a very strong emphasis on ethical culture, which I think is way overdue. And looking at that and assessing it and measuring it is really the right basis for program effectiveness, and not how many hotline calls you get, because ethical culture is what determines how people actually behave. We could talk about that later in terms of the Boeing case if anybody wants, but essentially they had a rule book that was 5 pounds in weight, but people still did things that led to great tragedy. And I know that Anna Paula is going to talk about risk analysis, so I won't go into that, but that is the foundation for an effective compliance program. And also ensuring that you don't just put a program in place and then forget about it, that you really need to make sure that your program is dynamic and addresses risks and changes elements to mitigate those risks. And the pandemic is a stark example of that. And then finally, ensuring that there are sufficient resources too. So let's go on to the next one. I'm mindful of the time. Every year we publish a program effectiveness report. And we published this one in March, just when the pandemic broke out. And it is on our website, and I would urge you to read it. It's based on a survey, which is very geared towards cultural factors, because as I mentioned, those are much more predictive of whether misconduct will occur. And the key principle that we can distill from that report is you need to go beyond the minimum required by law, regulation, or procedures and ask employees to live values, not just follow rules. And that principle is at the heart of why expectations are changing for boards as well. So let's go on to the next one. And just to take a look at some of the specific data, I'm not going to read the whole slide, but again, it's from our 2020 PEI report. High-performing organizations have boards of directors that really are actively engaged in ethics and compliance and take it seriously as they take other aspects that they oversee. And not only that, but as you can see on the bottom chart, in those organizations, boards, as well as other senior leaders, support effective sanctions or penalties on senior execs and high performers involved in misconduct. And that chart's pretty dramatic in terms of looking at how important that is. And that's an example of walking the walk as well as talking the talk. So hopefully that helped to set the stage. With that, I'll turn it back to Shay, and I'll be happy to answer questions and also engage in discussion.
Wonderful, Susan. That's very clear and quite provocative. And if I could turn to you, Karen, for your opening remarks. I'm not sure. Team, can we hear her?
Oh,
Karen, I believe you're in mute. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Now I fix. Thanks. So I was thanking Che for opening it up with your words about how companies are rethinking the way they relate to society, the way they relate to stakeholders, and how the expectations of stakeholders are changing as well. I want to start with this, probably many of you read it, New York Times piece published 50 years ago by Milton Friedman, an economist who 6 years after that won the Nobel Prize for economics. He wrote this article, which for decades was a foundation element for companies, their boards, C-suites, not only in the United States, but in many countries, including those of Latin America. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profit. This is called the shareholder primacy or primacy paradigm. So I'm going to focus on one of the things he wrote, which is businessmen, he said men, now you have to change to person, businessmen that declaim that business is not concerned merely with a profit, but also with promoting desirable social ends like providing employment, eliminating discrimination, avoiding pollution. They are preaching pure and unadulterated socialism. And he added, businessmen who talk this way are unwitting puppets of the intellectual forces that have been undermining the basis of a free society these past decades. I would argue that what is really undermining free societies today is extreme inequalities, not only in income and access to basic services, but also inequality of opportunities, which have become even more evident with the economic, social, and health consequences of the pandemic. Inequality has led to social unrest in many Latin American countries. It has also led to populism in many others, including the United States recently. And populists attack free trade, they attack private enterprises, and they attack the current free market model that exists in most countries today. So again, coming back to what undermines free societies is precisely what the unbridled capitalism has brought during these last decades. This is another, Susan showed some surveys. This is one by Edelman. They do this trust survey every year, and they shows how the people that say that the system is failing me has increased over the years, and that capitalism provokes this sense of injustice, this desire for change, lack of confidence. But what is important, the lack of hope is lost. So people do have hopes that this will change. And I think that the corporate world will play a key role in making this change. I also like to always put this cartoon from the New Yorker. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders, which talks about the environmental degradation that unbridled capitalism has brought, and that now is pushing us to probably what it is the worst danger that humanity faces, which is climate change. In the face of such high levels of risk and uncertainties, business reacted. 1 year ago, more than 180 CEOs joined together to issue a statement that revolutionized our business world. These executives shared a new definition for the purpose of a corporation, one that put priority in the needs of all stakeholders, not only shareholders. And this new generation of business leaders understood that delivering value to stakeholders will result in a robust and thriving business as well. The World Economic Forum followed suit with the Davos Manifesto that was published at the beginning of this year. So the vulnerabilities of the shareholder primacy model have been further, as I said, exposed during the pandemic. This is the same Edelman survey published in January of this year before the pandemic. 87% of people think that stakeholders, not shareholders, are more important to long-term company success. 33% said a company can take actions that both increase profits and improve conditions in the community where it operates. Then, after the pandemic, all these numbers went up to 91% that believe that business must benefit all stakeholders, and 85% say that it's not longer acceptable for companies just to make money. So, just to conclude, once the emergency mode is over, the emergency has led us to focus mainly on safety and business continuity. When that is over, companies will have to focus again in first, strengthening their resilience against current and future risks, reformulating their business models to increase their long-term value. And a key component of the board's fiduciary duty, which is risk oversight and contribution to create long-term growth, is to revisit the way in which companies relate to stakeholders. And in this context, improving performance in environmental, social, and corporate governance dimensions, ESG, has emerged as a top priority. A friend of mine, Andrea Bonin Blancs, also adds the T to the mix. So it would be ESG plus T, which has to do with technology and all the changes that digital transformation entails for companies. So I would leave it there, Che, and looking forward to talking about this further during the Q&A session.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen, for that. And I'm just reminded, of course, not only has the pandemic put the sustainability question on the top of our minds, but of course it's also charted new challenges when it comes to some of our technical difficulties, which is one of the reasons why you don't see me on the screen. And we're also always looking at the mute button as a daily reminder of how to be aware of that. So thank you for your patience, everyone. And there was a question before I move on to Ana Paula. We will distribute all the slides to you, so we will make sure that they're provided. So Ana Paula, please, over to you in your opening remarks.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So hello, everybody. So I'm very excited to be with such a diverse audience, and I hope to bring some food for thought and further discussions on the whys. So what I brought here is some piece of research. So I would like to start with the Kpmg research on the level of compliance maturity of Brazilian companies. So this is dated 2019. It was a research conducted on 240 companies of different regions, of different structures, and 300 respondents were interviewed. Only 33% of multinational companies, and the majority was located in the southeast and south of Brazil, which are the most developed regions in the country. So next slide shows, we can go to the next. Oh, next one, please. The next slide shows the gross income of those companies. You can see that very few have income over 5 billion reais a year. And which is important is the next slide showing that the level of maturity, the next slide, please. Okay, we can see the next one. So it's very, it's kind of small, but you will see that the level of maturity of the companies are below number 3. Number 1 is weak. Number 2 is bearable. 3 is mature. 4 integrated, and 5 advanced. Here in Brazil, the companies are just a little bit below mature. And you will see that the industries covered were consumer and retail, financial services, industrial markets, government and infrastructure, technology. So they covered practically most of the industries. And the average was 2.95. So we are almost number 3, meaning almost mature, but really not mature. So, but however, you can see in the next slide that that the matter is really important to the executives and board members. So why is that happening? What is missing? The next slide, you will see the parameters that led to the result. The next slide. So the questions that were, no, the previous one, please. The parameters that were covered that led to the level of maturity. So the knowledge of compliance and the capacity to define the appropriate risk appetite, the compliance culture, the level of commitment to compliance, budget associated to compliance, risk management integrated with compliance, compliance KPIs, and how the topic was discussed in the board meetings and how frequent. So this obviously was missing. Otherwise, we were not led to that to that average. So, and why was that? Why we were assigned the level 3? This is my perception in the next slide, that the main issues are what is missing: the tone at the top and a real culture of ethics. And compliance should be a state of mind and not a state of being. And we can explore this further later. And next, the board structure. I really think that the board structure is, of course, the center of the corporate governance, and is really what is missing here. And the second research that I would like to bring to you is a UI research, the next slide, showing what's going to be the main concern for the board members. So there were questionnaires applied between December 18 and January 19. A research focused on both public companies and privately held companies. And the research showed that risk management is going to be the main priority, one of the main priorities for the boards. So in the next slide, you can see what the boards are going to focus on. So here it says that the board must question management if they are intensifying efforts in educating employees on risk management issues. So for me, I really worry when risk management is a wish and not a mainstream issue. And the future is in the next slide. So risk management is going to be a focus, and the companies, in the next slide, the companies will focus on the definition and appraisal of risk management. Agustina, can you go to the next one? Okay, the next. Okay, thank you. So definition and appraisal of risk management, the integration of risk management into the decision-making process, and the use of technology. And we can discuss that later, this wish and why risk management is not mainstream, and why the boards are not taking the necessary actions, and also why compliance was assigned not efficient level of maturity. So this is what I wanted to show to you, the two very recent research conducted here in Brazil.
Wonderful.
So, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ana Paula. And what I think I'll do now is really open it up for questions and invite the audience to submit your questions in the inbox, and we are tracking them, and we will try to do our best to pose them to our panelists. But before we do that, just to continue on your presentation, Ana Paula, if I could ask the team to bring up a survey, and I encourage and invite all the attendees to answer this question. And the question is the following. Does your board of directors in your organization actively promote ethics and compliance? Fairly straightforward. Yes, consistently they do. Option B, sometimes they do, or never. So while we wait for the results of that come in, and hopefully it'll be interesting to see from a Latin America perspective and from the Americas perspective overall. And then we can get into a question about how these results may compare with other regions as well. So please do submit your answers, and then we'll proceed to comment on the results. So if I could ask the team to bring up the results when you can. Here we go. So that's quite interesting. And that's actually quite promising, more promising than I would have expected. And that 65 or 66%, let's say, think that the board of directors actively promotes ethics and compliance. And I guess I'll start with you, Karen, in terms of, well, all of you, in fact, do these results surprise you? And how do you see them being different from Latin America-based companies versus US and European multinationals? Karen, please.
Thank you. Well, one thing is what people say, and again, what really happens inside companies. And that's what Susan brought up, how to permeate this into this ethics and compliance into corporate culture and setting the tone from the top. Because many companies say they do. Let's talk about a US company recently, like Boeing, for example, did say they do it. They had a wonderful, by the way, annual report full of list of their accomplishments in terms of the relationship with stakeholders. But what happened, and we know what led to the accident that killed, two accidents, plane accidents that killed more than 300 people. There was an internal problem with compliance. They didn't comply with the minimum rules of safety, for example. So like those, there are many other examples of companies, Vale, which was mentioned here by Susan, Wells Fargo, etc., that, yes, they actively promoted ethics and compliance, but that didn't permeate into corporate culture, and there was no tone from the top to precisely promote it.
Wonderful. And Susan, we'd love to get your thoughts on if this result surprises you and whether you think this is a step change from if we would have asked a survey or conducted this survey, maybe a year or two years ago.
Thanks, Shay. Well, I think it's encouraging. And I hear, of course, what Karen's saying and completely agree with her. But I think what's important to bear in mind is what's driving the new role and expanded role for the board of directors is that the world has changed. It's not that boards of directors woke up one day and said, we need to move beyond profits. It's that the whole world has shifted. And our chairman of the board, Doug Seidman, talks about radical transparency. And you see that in cases like the Panama Papers, where the ugly underseam of tax evasion and illicit money flows was put in the public domain. So the end result of that is that what was hidden is now seen. And as a result, people care much more and they have much more knowledge. When I've come to Latin America, I've been struck by the grassroots reaction to corruption, which really wasn't there probably 15, 20 years ago, but now it is. And people paying tax in various countries really care whether they get good public services or whether the public officials are on the take and buying villas in the south of France. So what does all that mean? It means that boards of directors have to change with the times. And in the States, we haven't seen a major case where boards of directors have been held liable for failing to oversee the leadership and hold them accountable. But I think we will at some point. Certainly the Wells Fargo board was basically forced out by public criticism and regulatory criticism and pressure. And so I think that the pressure is there. It's not going to go away. And how boards respond to it is going to determine how and when they survive and how and when their organizations survive.
Wonderful, thank you. And Ana Paula, your reflections on this, especially with your presentation about the missing tone from the top and whether these results actually is something that you wouldn't expect. Your thoughts?
Well, I'm happy to see that, but I would like to understand the concept of actively promoting. So, because I would like to explore this further. So, what do you understand as actively promoting? Because in my research, here questions to be considered. So, I would like to explore that and ask if they have exclusive meetings, exclusive sessions, if they have the budget assigned, things like that. I would like to check the parameters that were considered in the Kpmg research and to check if all of that really exists in this. So then I would be really happy. But
fair
overall,
enough. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So, but I'm happy to see that. It's very encouraging. It really it is. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. And I don't think we'll be able to poll that specific question, Ana Paula, but let's give it a try.
Yeah, I know.
We have another polling question that may not perfectly speak to your question, but let's bring it up anyway. And if I could ask the team to bring up the following. My organization's board of directors helps us go beyond regulatory requirements to do the right thing, consistent with ESG goals and objectives. And similar choices here, consistently, sometimes, and never. And I guess this speaks to the point of, companies aren't just doing something for compliance purposes, but it's a reflection of they actually believe that it's the right thing to do and consistent with the ethics of the company objectives and their social purpose, if you will. Hopefully I'm not reading too much into that question. And then once we have the answers to that, then we'll get into maybe some comparisons between some leading Latin American countries and maybe a question that we have from the audience and whether, in fact, the ESG disclosures, as an example, should, in fact, be voluntary, or whether they, in fact, should be mandatory. But before we get into that, if I could ask the team to bring up the results, and then we'll, because that's quite interesting. So, Ana Paula, you raised the question, and I'd love to get your thoughts in terms of the results.
Consistently. So here, I can associate this result with my view of compliance being a state of mind and not a state of being. Because I think that compliance and also ESG is not a mere question of just checking the box and just confirming if your action is consistent and complying with the regulation and regulatory requirements. So you have to be every day thinking about what you can do that it's good for the environment, good for everybody, good for the other, good for the well-being of everybody, for the nature. So so when you comply not with the regulation, but so you go beyond. So here is a perfect example of compliance being a state of mind. So I'm happy to see that everybody's going into that direction. Yeah,
I mean, I do acknowledge that we may have a biased sample here in terms of the audience, but still, I mean, according to these results, it doesn't really seem that there's a problem. Which runs in the face, I know, in Europe, for instance, as an example, where the European Commission are going to put the corporate governance priority very much foremost in terms of some of the legislative developments, which gets into questions like forcing companies to disclose much more than they are currently doing, which gets into the mandatory versus voluntary, and in fact, they're looking to tie compensation of the board to disclosures. And I guess, Karen, if I can turn over to you, in Latin America, which countries do you think are doing well, which are leading? And do you think more should be done as far as maybe legislative or policy changes? And so where do you stand on the question of voluntary versus mandatory, and if in fact there needs to be more legislative changes to encourage more reporting?
Well, it is voluntary right now, but there's no framework to actually assess, and it's in the question of goals and objectives. Some companies have environmental goals and objectives, some have governance goals and objectives, but I don't see a strong, solid framework of ESG compliance in most companies. I would argue that I always prefer self-regulation rather than regulation, but we know that self-regulation does not necessarily work in many cases in Latin America. And then again, I would go to the Vale case, which, they had a great report on ESG compliance. They organized seminars about ESG. They were listed in the sustainability index in Bovespa. But what happened? There were governance problems. So when a call came 2 weeks before the Brumadinho disaster in January of last year, this was an expose by the Wall Street Journal. 2 weeks before, there was through the hotline, there was what we call a denuncia against the situation of be aware the tailing dams are in very bad conditions. And the CEO at that time, instead of saying, okay, let's investigate what's going on in the dams, what he said is, find the person who made this complaint. He's a cancer, quote unquote, in the company. So everything worked fine until the governance issue, which is how management, in this case the CEO, reacted to a claim that be aware that that this can happen because dams are not a good state. 2 weeks later, the tailing dam collapsed and killed 270 people. So again, you can say that you have a great ESG objectives, goals and objectives, as quoting the question. But again, what is the framework you're using? How do you audit that you really have a strong ESG framework? And does the E, the S, and the G work in coordination? Or is it more E than G, and then things like the Vale dam collapse happen?
Thank you so much. And Susan, if I can turn over to you, maybe to reflect on what Karen just shared with us, and maybe your reaction on the results, and your thoughts overall in terms of which Latin American countries do you think are leading the charge here, and do you think that there should be more mandatory disclosure versus the current voluntary regime?
Sure. Thanks, Shay. Well, to answer Karen's last point first, and I see that's in some of the questions too, somebody asked, what is a valid way to measure? Because what Karen's talking about is the dichotomy between what the rules say or what a company's code of conduct says or sustainability disclosures, as in the Vale case, and what the top executives actually do when the rubber hits the road. And clearly that was just a horrible tragedy that resulted. And so how do you measure culture? I mean, we do. And our experience is that really getting the voice of the employees in an anonymous third-party survey and asking questions about levels of trust and respect, and asking them in a behavioral way. So you're not just saying, check here if you think you've got a great compliance program, because that's meaningless. But really getting under the hood and seeing if people are being treated with respect, and really being encouraged to speak up without retaliation, and whether asking them whether their managers actually apply the company values when there's a difficult choice to make. I mean, it's easy to be compliant on a lovely sunny day, but it's hard when there's snow and ice out there. So anyway, I mean, again, focusing on culture and measuring that, I think, is really important. And in answer to the second part of the question, I want to go back kind of almost to the beginning of the webinar. When we had the Milton Friedman model that profits are everything, essentially, and that was very prevalent back in the 70s and the 80s, of course. What went with that was we can do the minimum required by law, and we can be, compliant. And so you saw elaborate tax schemes, and you saw people sort of shading what they did to just go up to the line and not over. And then a lot of research, a lot of work from FLRN in particular, shows that that doesn't actually promote compliance or behavior. That encourages people to say, I can go right up to the line and I'm fine. What really does encourage compliance about this is a commitment to values and to really live in those values. And to on an optimistic note, in my remarks here, during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of countries go well beyond what they're required to do by law, and really make things available, spend resources, forego opportunities because they don't want to put their employees in danger. Or we've also seen employees volunteer to self-isolate at plants to keep the essential functions going. And again, that's not behavior that we can drive by regulation. That's behavior that comes from this greater sense, abandoning Milton Friedman, that we're all in this together. And what we do as individuals and organizations affects how the world's going to be.
Wonderful, thank you. And just to be aware, Susan, there's some issues with your mic, just to be aware, but we could hear a majority or part of it. So I guess there's a number of questions here. Well, two observations. The first is I'm monitoring the questions that are coming in, and the survey, I tell you, it doesn't reflect the questions that are coming in, because there's a number of people here who are actually, what's the sample size here? And I think it's more, talk than action. Yes, companies say that they want to do the right thing, but how does that actually translate into corporate behavior? And the second piece, which is a wonderful question, I think, which is really about what specific metrics are used to monitor ethical behavior. Someone makes a reference to ISO 37001, which apparently is an anti-bribery system. And has a very strong values-based and board-led approach. But there's other questions here about what specific metrics do companies use, should they use, or to the point I think that you made, Karen, that there just isn't a framework, a common framework that's really been adopted. So maybe Ana Paula, if I can turn to you to reflect on that in terms of are there specific metrics clear, and is there a common framework that companies can actually use when you start comparing approaches and cultural change?
Well, there are two ISO. I don't exactly remember the numbers, but one is this one. One is anti-bribery. The other one relates to compliance. And here in Brazil, there is another one from the ethics community. So I think that each country, must have something, but in terms of region, I don't see something specific for the region, for a framework. But I think that there are some self-regulatory agencies, for instance, here in Brazil, for the financial markets. There is. So it's very important that players join the self-regulatory agencies and have this kind of seal. So because this inspires others, of course, and this we have more confidence. The consumers of the products, of course, will have more confidence when they are buying financial products and retail products as well. But companies, I don't see a general framework.
And
but they may join the ISOs.
Any other comments on this or reactions? I'll leave it up to.
If I may, in the case of in the case of ESG, we have a real problem. There are more than 300 providers of measurements or index that cover ESG companies. So there's no consistency in terms of what they cover, how much weight they give to each factor. So the OECD in its latest report, which I highly recommend, urges regulators and companies to work together and find one common measure, like they did with the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures, which provides one framework for climate change risks and opportunities. So you have situations like the following. This is a case I read in the UK. MSCI gave a very high punctuation to a retailer called Boohoo, especially in terms of how they manage their, it's a fast fashion company, how they manage their supply chain. So many funds invested in that company. What happened? A piece, an expose by the Sunday Times in the UK showed that Boohoo workers and contractors were earning less than the minimum wage in many countries where they have their production facilities, but also in the UK. So the share dropped, I don't know, more than 40%. And several funds were hit by this because of a very good recommendation, a very good mark, a very good index by one of these companies. So we really need one framework because otherwise you're going to have like Tesla rates very well on the E of the equation, but very bad on the G of the equation. So it's high in the top of many indexes and low in the bottom of many others. So we urgently need one framework. There is work being done by especially EU regulators, some of the US regulators, also some of the US organizations, to work on one framework. And that's something that in Latin America doesn't even exist, the framework that we need.
That's a great...
If I can,
please. Go ahead, Susan, please.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that. Just to go back to kind of what I was saying before, because I think it's really important. What you measure is as important as what you do in many ways, because what gets measured gets done. And again, what we see is that actually measuring culture in a meaningful way by asking employees as broadly as you can questions about whether the company is actually living its values or whether their manager, in fact, is making decisions that are put profit over sustainability, that's the most effective way to find out internally what's going on. And it's interesting, somebody brought up ISO, because we just had the General Counsel of Novartis on a webinar 2 weeks ago about the UN Global Compact Goal 16. And she said ISO is not a good measure to use. And there's a number of other people, including myself, who think that, because again, it's a checklist. And you're going to have situations like Vale, Boeing, like BOHO, if you don't really have a way of tapping into what's happening on the ground and whether the company is in fact walking the walk as well as talking the walk. And regulators in the US get that now. And they ask companies regularly if they've measured their culture and if they've basically done broad cultural surveys that allow you to benchmark and see if you're really committed to integrity, transparency, and respect. So hopefully that's a perspective to leave people with.
Absolutely, and no, thanks very much for that, Susan. And I'm astounded. I keep getting challenges to our survey here. Someone making a point about, look, there's probably a skew towards the banking sector, which are, more regulated rather than a non-banking sector, which may help explain potentially some of the results. But also to your point, Karen, that it might be a crude measure, but when you look at different sectors, then that may skew things very differently. The technology sector that you mentioned have a very different ESG or sustainability footprint rather than a commodities extractive industry or company, and so that's important to keep in mind, so that you're not comparing different companies in different sectors. And I guess as we're concluding, just a few remarks. We just have a few more minutes, but I do want to press on this point of how Latin America is doing compared to other regions. Do you think Latin America as a whole, or are there specific countries, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, or other countries who you think are leading here, and how do you think the Americas doing overall compared to Europe or China or other regions of the world? And I'll start with you, Ana Paula, and then hopefully if we keep the comments brief, and then we'll summarize and we'll conclude. But Ana Paula, please, over to you.
In terms of compliance, I think that we are progressing. I think that we are doing well. We are progressing, as we could see from the research. Of course, we have not integrated and we are not advanced, but we are on our way to. From my perspective, I think that we have homework to do at the board level, which is the most important factor here to be considered. There's a lot to do regarding the board structure, from my perspective, which will improve the level of compliance. But I think that we are doing well. Next time the research will be conducted, we will be near the integrated level.
Wonderful. Karen, your thoughts? And then finally, Susan.
Yes, thanks. In Latin America, I think that in terms of ESG, we still have a long way to go. The S of the equation today, which stands for social, but it also stands for stakeholders, is key. And we saw in most Latin American countries is social unrest. People are upset because of inequality. Many of these people work in companies. So employers should look not only into employment, salary, and benefits, but go a little further on the S. Work-life balance, mental and financial health, train people on job training, issues like not only measure satisfaction, but measure, do you have good access to healthcare, for example? And what do we, which in Latin America, public sector health is dismal. So what can we do as a company to help our employees? So also focus on other stakeholders like clients and customers, supply chain, the society or the community in which we operate. So we still have a long way to go. I think that now the urgency is to focus on the S, because if social unrest continues, and I go back to my slide, if social unrest continues and populism emerges as a consequence of that, which is happening already, our free societies are going to die. So in order to preserve the system, companies need to play an important role, and that means focusing more on ESG.
Wonderful. And Susan, you get the last word, and then I'll have a concluding remark.
Okay, Shay. I'll keep it brief. I think, unfortunately, things change when there are terrible disasters, and the Odebrecht scandal, which brought down a number of governments, and then the Valley Dam collapse, which Karen's done a wonderful job of unpacking, I think were really shocking to people. And as a result, we really see an improvement in Latin America and a much stronger commitment to ethics and compliance. And I certainly hope that continues. Thanks. It's really been a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much on behalf of Refinitiv. All of you out there, please join me in thanking our panelists, Susan, Ana Paula, and Karen, for their thoughts. We will provide this, of course, available for those who couldn't join us live. Apologies again to all of you with some of our technical difficulties. This is one of the brave new world that we live in. Unfortunately, I couldn't join you by video, but hopefully my audio at least worked to your satisfaction. And then quickly on the, I guess my last word on the S, and give you a sense of what we're doing at Refinitiv. So the E is fairly well understood. The G, somewhat, versus the S is not well understood at all. So we are working with Thomson Reuters Foundation, with the other institutional investor organizations, really to build out what S really means in terms of what are the metrics, what are the standards, and we have 190 different indicators on the S, but institutional investors don't want 190, they want 10. So what are they? And according to some of the research that we've done, when you look at companies with a higher S score, they actually tend to do better financially. And the social, of course, includes diversity, inclusion, labor rights, human rights, and many other aspects. And so this is not just about, either it's profit or being seen to do good in the world, but they're not mutually exclusive whatsoever. And that's our research that is actually showing that that's the case. So I'll leave it there. Again, thank you very much. We went a bit over time, but hopefully that's okay. Again, let me thank our panelists. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us all. I wish you a very, very happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year, and look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.